Hello, I'm Tom Athanasiou, Tom A, and I'm very pleased to be with you today. The obvious first question, since you're looking at me talk on a screen somewhere, is why you should care what I think. And the answer, I think, is that I've been around the block. I've been a left green forever. I was bitten by the climate bug way back in the late 1980s, even before I wrote Divided Planet. I started attending the climate meetings in the late 90s. I founded the equity working group of CAN, the Climate Action Network International, years before Paris. I worked very hard on the equity agenda in the years before Paris. And by the way, and I suppose by way of self-introduction, let me clearly state that I consider Paris to be a major victory, a turning point in the climate negotiations, and in fact in the struggle for effective democratic global governance. And yes, I'm fully aware of the fact that this is not a universally held view within the more radical wings of the climate movement, which worked hard to frame Paris as a failure. Nevertheless, I think it's fairly obvious at this point, after Trump's election, that Paris was not a failure. Who among us would wish today that we had not managed to bank the Paris Agreement before Mr. Trump's election? What strategic storyline exists within which that would make any sense at all? As for the future and actually stabilizing the climate system, I'm co-director of the Climate Equity Reference Project. You could Google it. And one of the organizers of this CSO Equity Coalition, which continues to work to promote the equity agenda, mostly within the climate negotiations. I am, in other words, I suppose, a global climate equity specialist. And what I want to say at this point is that this can be a challenge to explain to people in the United States, even climate justice people, which is why long ago I developed a quick rap to explain what I do. To wit, I tell people that my work is focused on one central question. What kind of global climate deal would be fair enough to actually work, to actually have a chance at stabilizing the climate system? So, first up, we are not doomed. I say this because at the time of this recording, it's only been a few weeks since the David Wallace Wells piece, The Uninhabitable Earth, was published in New York Magazine. And if nothing else, this piece and its amazing popularity made the depth of the anxiety absolutely clear. To wit, the more people know about the climate crisis, the more afraid they are. Now, the climate communications people, the comms people, have been trying to keep this anxiety at bay for years. But the real predicament, I think, is a bit different from one that they've usually been putting forward. The comms people are, of course, right that pessimism and despair are self-fulfilling prophecies. They are deeply and profoundly disempowering. No doubt about this. But this isn't the end of the story. It's also true that many, many people think we're in deep trouble, that in fact our civilization is doomed. And more people are reaching this conclusion every year. And by the way, I'm not just speaking of people on the left. Given this, it makes no sense to speak for climate science and on the other hand to say, even in the face of its rather terrifying message, that there's nothing to be afraid of, that basically things can stay the same. Things cannot stay the same, and they're not going to stay the same. More than this, it makes absolutely no sense, politically or morally, to soft pedal the depth of our predicament. So what does make sense? Well, we have to begin with the science. The permafrost methane pulses, the permanent drought that may soon overtake the Mediterranean basin, the sixth extinction, the tipping points, all the rest of it. And then on that basis, we have to put forward a vision and a strategy for a massive transition, one that begins with a global emergency mobilization. And then the hard part, that vision has to be both believable and attractive. The problem is that, given the state of the world, doing this is very difficult indeed. Not just because people are afraid of change, but also because they look around and frankly, they find it difficult to believe that we're going to rouse ourselves to fight for a just and sustainable future. There's obviously a lot to say about this, but start with the first thing, which is that we haven't got the time to get past capitalism before we can stabilize the climate. The clock is ticking, and we're going to have to make the turn within capitalism, or we're not going to make it at all. Now, on the other hand, capitalism as we know it will not survive the climate transition. This too is true. And it presents us with the very real problem of understanding just what the hell we're up to. The world is not going to stay the same, but the old term revolution, made newly popular by the Sanders people, hardly connotes the complexity of understanding the change. All this is actually a major problem for both the left and the Green movement, both of which have long been troubled, if not beset, by pessimistic and dystopian imaginings. The way forward? One helpful reference point is Cory Doctorow's work. The way he put his position at a recent panel discussion, it was called Science Fiction and the Resistance, is that we need stories that show us honestly confronting the grim days that are now ahead, and then show us getting through those grim days to something new and better on the other side, that show the truth, but also the possibility. Some new kind of cooperative commonwealth, one that's both fairness forward and emancipatory, liberty forward, some kind of redemption, one that allows us to live, really live, within planetary limits, even if we have to do so on a damaged and diminished planet. Some kind of vision that opens doors to strategic thinking. In any case, there's still a path forward, though it's going to have to cut through some pretty forbidding territory. Not that I have to spend much time today talking about sea level rise or desertification, about heat waves or food shortages or mass migration. At this point, we're all pretty much up to speed on the basics. The next question begins by getting straight on what we might call the technology question. To wit, the way forward has a lot to do with technology solutions, but it's not essentially a technological way. A recent email from Bill McKibben, written for 350, set up this point well by prioritizing two challenges. The first is stopping new fossil fuel infrastructure, which is core to the overarching challenge of forcing and then managing the rapid phase out of fossil energy, to what some folks are calling the managed decline of the fossil fuel economy. The second is driving hard to a 100% renewables future, which, by the way, is going to be very, very difficult to realize in time. Remember, time is short. The vision here is net zero emissions, but if we want to hold the Paris temperature target, we don't have more than about 50 years to get there. And to these two challenges, I would add a third, which is that not only do we have to decarbonize the entire global economy, and fast, but we have to do so while ensuring that everyone has access to the energy services they need to live fulfilling and dignified lives. We have to phase out fossil fuels while opening paths to what used to be called, earlier in more naive days, development. And we have to do so for all people everywhere. To summarize, pretty much all important approaches to the new future raise major technological issues, but none are, at their very bottom, about technology. Rather, they're about the challenges of transformative change and about avoiding further fossil energy lock-in, and about the power of the fossil cartel, and about acting in the short term with the long term firmly in mind. They're about the challenges of change, really rapid change, in a world that's harshly stratified into winners and losers, a world in which it's easy for fossil fuel plutocrats, think the Koch brothers, to contrive blocking coalitions designed to keep the climate transition forever stalled. But here's a thought. What if, despite the urgency of technology side battles, the technology side of the climate transition problem has essentially already been solved? What if, even though there are still millions of fine points to be resolved and huge deployment and scaling problems to be managed, and huge and proliferating false solutions to be avoided, the fine points and problems have still got a lot more to do with politics and economics and with the great challenge of just transitions than they do with either gigawatts or gigatons. In fact, this is exactly the situation, which is why there's no excuse for the way in which technology side frames dominate the strategic agenda, as they do, particularly in the US and Europe, where both climate funders and pragmatic movement strategists have long fixated on techno-economic progress to the point where technology debates have come to almost entirely dominate the strategic debate, to the point that this dominance itself has become a key strategic problem. To be absolutely clear, my claim is that at the highest level, we only need two things to save ourselves and our civilization. The first is indeed a thoroughgoing green technology revolution. But the second is a high cooperation world, and it's long past time to focus on the second, and on the unforgiving fact that a high cooperation world is not and will never be possible at anything like today's absurd level of economic and social stratification. Which is why, to make a long story short, the climate transition is either going to be fairness forward or it's going to fail. Why the real question at the core of climate politics, as I noted at the outset, is what kind of transition strategy is fair enough to actually succeed. It's the core question, and it's not techno-economic. It's a justice question. Nothing about the climate transition is going to be simple. Consider Donald Trump's election as President of the United States, and consider that just before Trump, there was the Paris Agreement and its celebrated goal of, quote, holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius, while pursuing efforts to limit this temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So here's a question. When Dave Roberts, one of America's premier climate bloggers, published a post-election reaction piece that he entitled, "Trump's Election Marks the End of Any Serious Hope of Limiting Climate Change to 2 degrees," was he right? I don't think he was, not at least in any straightforward way. For one thing, and most importantly, we were not, before Trump's election, on track to achieve the Paris temperature targets. Not that there wasn't ground for legitimate optimism. There was, because there really was and is an unprecedented wave of clean energy innovation sweeping the world. Yet at the same time, there wasn't, because this wave was never going to be enough, and everybody knew it. So what was the strategy, and what is it today? To answer this question, I'm going to have to introduce a bit of jargon. To wit, pre-Trump optimism was based on the belief that, with Paris in place, countries would steadily ratchet up their pledges and their actions. The key idea here is an ambition ratchet or an ambition mechanism. The terms are interchangeable, but the idea is critical because it's the idea at the core of the Paris Agreement that with a new universal treaty in place, one that includes all countries, we will move into a new world in which ambition will be continually, iteratively increased. And this is a good idea, an excellent one actually. And this is true despite the fact that both the first round pledges of national action and the first round pledges of international transition support are far too weak to actually achieve Paris's well below 2°C temperature target. What Dave Roberts was saying in his post-election reaction piece was that with the Trump people in office, the ambition ratchet would not turn, and that the 2-degree target would slip forever out of reach. Was he right? Maybe. But my point is that the proper beginning of this conversation is that the ratchet wasn't going to turn fast enough, even if Trump lost, because that was just going to leave us in a business as usual world. Nor is this just another bit of radical pessimism. Just recently, senior climate scientist Michael Oppenheimer said that he thought Trump's election had reduced our chances of holding the 2-degree line from about 20% to about 10%. In other words, he agreed with Roberts. My point, for what it's worth, is that the future is unwritten and that the chances of a meaningful mobilization are greater today than they were before the election catastrophe. That, to stick with Oppenheimer's rough numbers, the chances of holding the 2-degree target are now greater than 20% rather than less, and this precisely because Trump's election was a massive wake-up call. Does this seem a desperate claim? No doubt it does, for it is. Again, we are in trouble, and it will do no good to pretend otherwise. Ask Al Gore, who lived to regret the easy optimism with which his otherwise fine first movie ended. In any case, if we're both smart and lucky, and if we manage to backlash or slingshot off the Trump catastrophe and into a high mobilization future, then the path we're on now will take us farther and faster than the path through a Clintonian business as usual world could ever have done. If we're both smart and lucky. The climate justice movement has already done a fantastic amount of good. It may even be on its way to transforming environmentalism, turning it into a justice-centered movement. In any case, these are no longer the early days of climate justice. To give an example from the global side, which is the one I know best, it's now common for climate folks to recognize and clearly explain that as the impacts worsen, the poor and the innocent will suffer the most. This is crucial progress and something to celebrate. But it's still only the tip of the iceberg. To see the whole thing, think of success with real intention. Plan to win. Plan to stabilize the climate system. Remember that the global drive to draw down greenhouse gas emissions to zero, and as soon as humanly possible, is itself the most important global climate justice challenge. This because no amount of adaptation can yield justice on a 4-degree world, or indeed a 3-degree world, or indeed, it now seems, a 2-degree world, even if we were to achieve it. The core climate justice issue is that without justice, we will fail to stabilize the planetary climate system, and that this will be the greatest injustice of them all. There's a lot to say about this, obviously, but the point is that transitional justice is a strategic necessity, and that refusing to recognize this, refusing to give it pride of place in our stories and our strategies, well, at a certain point, such refusal itself becomes a kind of denialism. Yes, we need technology. We need offshore wind and solar storage if we're to make it to the other side. But these won't be enough. We also need robust cooperation if we're to achieve a global climate transition and achieve it in time. And the cooperation we need will never be possible at today's level of economic stratification. For many years, George Orwell wrote a column which he called In Front of Your Nose. The title is self-explanatory. The big challenges are not difficult to find. They're like the desperate and the homeless. They're everywhere. We step over them, averting our eyes to get on with our daily lives. And now, if we would face the real conditions of our lives, our real conditions of existence, we have to learn to see them again. The challenge of cooperation is in front of our noses in just this way. It is everywhere obvious in today's political crisis, which is itself, to a significant degree, a side effect of a decades-long process of right-wing radicalization. Call it neoliberalism or market fundamentalism. Whatever you call it, know that it's a convenient ideology, and that after the collapse of the Iron Curtain, it took on extreme forms of expression, and that it has lately engendered a hard and ugly populism. The best marker of its origins was probably Margaret Thatcher's strange claims that there's no such thing as society. On utterance, she further explained by saying, there are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people must look after themselves first. This, in a time of planetary crisis, is the language of extermination. But let's be clear. Resistance is a necessary but insufficient alternative. We have to think big, and this means that we need government, and not just national government. We need functional local governance too, and real progress towards functional global governance as well. And we need them fast. The environmental crisis, and the climate crisis in particular, is a commons crisis, and can only be successfully addressed if we act as if we're in this together, if we act as a society, which is indeed, contrary to Thatcher, a thing. And in particular, if we act as a society that is governed well and democratically in the interests of all. There's a lot to say about this, but the short version of the story is that we've become used to a bare and denuded political landscape, as if the tragedy of the commons were our fate, as if the disciplines of austerity were necessary to save us from ourselves and our appetites, as if the old convenient pessimisms, the one that show us that the poor we will always have with us, were somehow natural facts. Ultimately, climate is a global commons problem, and as is well understood, common problems can best be solved by high cooperation arrangements in which each actor is seen by the others to be doing their best to do their fair share to meet the common challenge. As the IPCC said in its fifth assessment report, an agreement seen as equitable can lead to more effective cooperation. The point, more particularly, is that robust cooperation is necessary to any high-ambition climate transition, but it is simply not possible in a world that promises only rigid stratification. The details are beyond the scope of this talk, but the bottom line is that inequality is a social poison. The extreme polarization which characterizes the new politics is, I believe, both evidence for this claim and a warning that we would do well to heed. The climate transition must simultaneously be a transition into a fairer world. Nothing else will work. Never forget that the richest 1% of the world's population now owns more wealth than everyone else put together. This, in the end, is the greatest of the equity challenges that are now before us. Still, set it aside, at least for a second, because it's useful in thinking about the climate challenge to consider the specific climate equity challenges that come up when we think about true mobilization, about moving forward at the necessary speed. Here's a brief but I think useful list, which we developed at the Climate Equity Reference Project at SERP. First, remember how difficult it will be to hold the warming to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. This is why any proper list of climate-specific equity challenges has to begin with ratcheting up global ambition. The key point here is that for such ratcheting to work, we have to face the grand challenge of providing technical and financial support to poor and developing countries, which cannot possibly pursue high ambition, low carbon development paths on their own. But even 2 degrees will deliver tremendous destruction. Adapting to this reality thus has to come second on the list of climate equity challenges, and as anyone familiar with the negotiations will tell you, the adaptation challenge is even more difficult than global decarbonization. Moreover, adaptation has limits. There's also the grim reality of what we now call loss and damage, 2 flat words that purport to describe the challenge of irredeemable destruction and of all that comes with it. The third profound climate equity challenge has to be the just transition challenge itself. Here a bit of clarification is necessary. For the just transition term, which by the way originated in the US labor movement, is typically taken to mean transition assistance for workers and communities that are dependent on fossil fuel extraction and related industries. Such assistance, however, is only the beginning of the real just transition challenge. Remember, we have to change everything. And this means that there's going to be tremendous disruption on every side. Much of it will be positive, of course. The new world of distributed energy and low carbon technology has a great deal to recommend it. But at the same time, we have to move fast, very fast. And this means that the climate transition is going to be extremely disruptive. And as the US election has shown, many people feel quite disrupted enough, thank you. Fourth, consider the problem of keeping it in the ground. And note that there's far more coal, oil, and gas on this planet than we can ever hope to safely extract. So, what does this mean for poor countries that were counting on using their fossil resources to help lift themselves into the modern world? Will they be expected to cede this development path without any sort of compensation? This is not a theoretical question. It's already time to stop investing in fossil infrastructure if indeed we intend to hold the Paris temperature targets. But what about the losers? This is a fine seg to the overarching challenge of global effort sharing, which is next on my list of climate equity challenges. For while it's one thing to note that decarbonization and adaptation and loss and damage and just transition support are all profound equity challenges, it's another thing to realize that taken together, they add to a global challenge that simply can't be ignored if we're to have any real chance of success, which is the point of enumerating all these various sides of the climate transition challenge, a challenge that the world's people will only embrace if it comes along with an overall sense of fairness. Remember, if people think they're being chumped, they will resist. So, finally, there's economic and developmental justice, which has always been at the core of the climate equity challenge, both between countries and within countries. China's emergence as the global manufacturing core is the key case in point here. For while it lifted more people out of poverty than any other single event in human history, it was also the source of an immense emissions pulse. And within countries, too, prosperity and well-being are still strongly associated with the increased use of both energy and materials and increased emissions. If anything is certain, is that this has to change. Obviously, this is a daunting set of challenges. That's why I listed them. Less obviously, but just as importantly, all these challenges can be met. I don't have time to make the case right now, but I will remind you that we're on the cusp of a tremendous technological revolution, one that, by the way, is not in any way limited to what we call green technologies. I haven't discussed the other sides of the technology revolution, from robotics to artificial intelligence to the emergence of cheap and easy gene editing techniques. But I think it's efficient here to simply mention them and to note that they too will be catalysts of disruption, and that while they bear tremendous promise, they also threaten to reinforce the tendency already dominant towards poisonous levels of economic stratification. Which brings me to one of my concluding points. Economic stratification has literally become an existential threat, a danger to humanity and to human civilization. This is true for the simple reason that a high cooperation world, though a necessary foundation of the great transition that we now so desperately need, is impossible to even imagine in a society that is as stratified as the one we now inhabit. But again, this does not mean that we are doomed. Rather, it means that the drive to stabilize the climate must become simultaneously and very publicly a drive to turn towards economic and developmental justice. Only then will anything like the necessary level of cooperation become possible. There's talk from time to time about the need for a war mobilization to stabilize the climate system. This is a problematic metaphor, but it's not without its virtues. One of them is that in war we cooperate and to the very limits of our ability. And this is exactly what we have to do today. But we won't. Not if climate destabilization is the only adversary against which we're mobilizing. Naomi Klein argues in This Changes Everything that the climate crisis presents us with a powerful new way of thinking big, that in fact it forces us to think big. My argument, a closely related one, is that the climate crisis, narrowly conceived, is too small a problem to solve. The reference here is to Dwight Eisenhower, who once said that whenever I run into a problem I can't solve, I always make it bigger. This is sometimes called the Eisenhower principle, and it sure seems to me to be apropos, because in a time of big history, thinking small is a recipe for disaster. Anthropologist Jared Diamond, in his 2005 classic, Collapse, warned that societies in which decision-making elites are able to retreat behind protective barricades and thus to insulate themselves from the suffering of the larger population are exactly the societies that do not adapt to pressing circumstances, exactly the societies that, particularly when confronted with environmental and social limits, choose to fail. The lesson here is that, properly considered, the climate crisis is big enough to solve. But that means realizing, as did Pope Francis, that economic injustice and climate catastrophe are two sides of one coin, which is to say that the best ways forward are those that address both sides of the problem at the same time, ways that reduce economic division even as they lay the ground for a rapid climate transition. There are lots of good ideas for how to do this, thousands of ideas. Green jobs and green infrastructure, the basic guaranteed income, cap and dividend, democracy, strong social and environmental rules at all levels of the economy, the deliberate choice to make high technology work for all and not for just the lucky few, a universal climate treaty that's explicitly designed to drive renewables and at the same time to lift up the poor. The list is long, but the point is simple. We have to think big, and we have to do it now.